God said, say we. But I shook my head. I hid my hands tight behind my back and said stubbornly, I. God said, say we. But I looked upon them grisly and all awry. Myself in those twisted shapes, ah no. Distastefully, I turned my head away, persisting, they. God said, say we. But I held my distance. I would not join. Carelessly and arrogantly, I rejected my place with my people. God said, say we, and I at last, richer by a hoard of years and tears, looked into their eyes and found the heavy word that bent my neck and bowed my head. Like a shamed child, then I mumbled low, we, God. I think this poem offers us a really important truth, that we are connected, that we are united, one. I think it's something we all long for, to transcend that feeling of being alone, to know our connections, to know our wholeness. Yet, as the poet says, the way in is not an easy one. The path goes straight through what we have the most trouble embracing. As Jesus said, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these, you, my brothers and sisters, you did for me. And we even have our own local hero, Indiana's Eugene Debs, who said something similar. He said, years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living beings. And I made up my mind then that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Me in those twisted shapes, ah no. As I read Baker's poem, I find myself intrigued by this journey from I to we. What changed him? What awakened his heart? All we know is that he found himself richer by a hoard of years and tears. Perhaps through all those years and tears, the poet finally began to see himself in those twisted shapes, grisly and all awry. Perhaps he began to see his own reflection in the reflection of others. Within the Islamic tradition, there's a buffoonish and maybe wise teacher known as Nasruddin. Lots of tales told with him at the center of these stories. And Nasruddin awakens us with humor and foolishness. And in one particular story, a somewhat gruff and pretentious philosopher made an appointment to dispute with Nasruddin. And the philosopher arrived at the appointed hour, but found that Nasruddin was away from his home. Nasruddin supposedly had forgotten their plans and was in a tea house playing games and telling stories with his friends. After waiting for some time, the philosopher grew angry. Picking up a piece of chalk, he wrote "stupid oaf" on Nasruddin's door and left in a huff. As soon as Nasruddin got home and saw this, he rushed to the philosopher's house. I had completely forgotten our appointment, he said. I apologize for not having been home. Of course, I remembered the appointment as soon as I saw that you left your name on my door. He's the holy jester, Nasrun, a divine fool who makes us question whether he is a complete idiot or an enlightened sage. In the story, I think Nasrudin is teaching us, using humor to help us understand that the outside is often closely linked to the inside, that our projections onto the world, you are a stupid oaf, are often not far off from our own internal experience. I am a stupid oaf. In this little tale, Nasrudin lifts up a mirror before the philosopher's eyes, and if the philosopher is perceptive, he might see how his own intolerance for others is also an intolerance for himself. It is a basic psychological understanding that what we find difficult to accept in others is what we also find difficult to accept in ourselves. Our incapacity to love certain people, whether they are poor or sick or ugly or angry or forgetful or whatever, directly connects with the aversion we have for various parts of our very own souls. Carl Jung wrote that I feed the beggar, that I forgive an insult, that I love my enemy. All these are undoubtedly great virtues. But what if I should discover that the least amongst them all, the poorest of all beggars, the most impotent of all offenders, yea, the very fiend himself, that these are within me, and that I myself stand in need of the alms of my own kindness, that I am myself and the enemy who must be loved? What then? Myself in those twisted shapes? Ah, no. Religious conservatives and religious liberals have typically responded differently to these difficult parts of ourselves. The religious conservative tends to, and this is a generalization, of course, but tends to view the world and thus him or herself through the lens of good and evil. The good must be encouraged and the evil must be eliminated, must be vanquished, suppressed at least. The evil parts of oneself, anger, lust, laziness, pride, greed must be resisted and repressed. And the religious liberal tends to see the world and thus him or herself a bit different and more in terms of wholeness. Integration is sought rather than repression. Difficult feelings with oneself are to be approached through presence and compassion. Yet, of course, in the truth of day-to-day living, and regardless of our theological beliefs and where we put ourselves on any kind of theological spectrum, we all repress aspects of ourselves. There are feelings within that can seem too big to handle, and repression allows us to shut away those forces for a time. Yet such is only a temporary reprieve. Such denied inner truths eventually find ways to assert themselves. We see it all the time in public figures who have fallen in their own hypocrisy. Those stupid oaf comments can come back to haunt us. We see it in our society's denial of our violent capacities as we call for more good guys with guns to solve our mass murder problem. We see it in higher rates of divorce and unwanted pregnancies as sexual abuse in the areas that we most often choose to reject comprehensive sexuality education. You know, and one of the most, I think, painful things that I've come to witness in my work with people experiencing homelessness is the extraordinary level of judgment and hatred even directed at people in poverty, especially the homeless. You know, an author, Martha Beck, she writes that one of our greatest fears, a fear that holds so many people back, is, as she describes it, the fear of becoming a bag lady. Perhaps our society expresses such great difficulty, vitriol even, towards the poor because subconsciously we're terrified of becoming poor ourselves. By making the poor into those people, them over there, then we never have to fear that we could become one of those people. They're different from us. We're better than they are. Psychologist Ellen Moore writes, "It is as if our wholeness is stalking us, calling to us, whispering to us to stop resisting its summons. The hound of heaven pursues us, and nothing satisfies our soul until we allow all of the scattered pieces of ourselves to reunite. To become whole, we must descend into the fear and pain and uncertainty in order to become who we truly are. Nasrudin was outside on his hands and knees below a lantern when a friend walked up. He was outside, looking around, searching below this light. Before him, it was dark. And this friend walked up to him and said, "What are you doing, Nasrudin?" And his friend asked, he said, "Well, I'm looking for my key. I've lost it." So his friend got down on his hands and knees too, and they both started searching for a long time in the dirt beneath the lantern. Finding nothing, his friend finally turned to him and asked, "Where exactly did you lose it?" And Nasrudin replied, "Well, I lost it in the house, but there's more light out here." How often do we search for the key to our lives in the light when we know it lies in darkness? The poem "The Well of Grief" by David White reads, "Those who will not slip beneath the still surface on the well of grief, turning downward through its black water to the place we cannot breathe, will never know the source from which we drink. The secret water cold and clear, nor find in its darkness glimmering the small round coins, the small round coins thrown by those who wished for something else." There are so many parts of ourselves, hated, feared, that we place within the shadow of our own psyches. In Nasrudin's dark home and David White's well of grief. Yet within this darkness, we find the lost key. Beneath the black water, cold and clear, are the glimmering round coins. And the only way in is compassion. May Sarton tells us, "Love opens the door into everything, as far as I can see, including and perhaps most of all, the door into one's own secret and often terrible and frightening real self." Love is Nasrudin's key into the dark house. And it is through our presence and compassion to our ever so frightening self that our fears lose their sway. Psychologist Gay Hendricks shares, the disowned wolves of our dark inner forests are baying for recognition. Bow to them and watch their ferocity dissolve. Today is the 23rd anniversary of my ordination into the Unitarian Universalist ministry, April 16th, in the year 2000. I was 29 years old, and I'm older than that now. And I started out in congregational ministry, and that's where I thought my career was going. And I served in churches for 10 years. But somehow found my way into working with people in poverty over at what turns out to be almost the last 14 years, in a surprising twist in my own kind of work. And so, as you know, when you hit a major anniversary like that, you tend to start to think about things and reflect on things, and how did we get here, and how did I get here, and how did this all this occur? And the other day I was talking to one of our clients, a person we work with, one of our guests of our day center, and he's been homeless for a long time, and he struggles pretty mightily with a lot of things, but particularly with alcoholism. And so we were talking, and he said something along the lines of, we were talking about his family. I was asking him about his history and his background, and he started to talk about his sister, which is his only surviving family member at this point. And he said something like, she thinks he drinks too much. I drink too much. She thinks I drink too much. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's true. And he gave me a look like whether he get mad or not that I said that. And then we both really started laughing. And he later said something which I thought was hysterical, which is he pointed to some noodles on his table, and he said, I drink, but I also eat soup, which I thought was amazing. But but in our conversation, right after that point where I mentioned that about him drinking too much, he went on and he said, I'm not perfect. And just like this, recognition of very humble recognition of his challenges. And, I said to him, who is? And I think, if anything, that's been the journey of these 23 years of ordination, is getting to a point of accepting who is, and accepting that it's okay, and that we find our solidarity and our connection and our humanity within each other, not necessarily by being great, but by being honest and being truthful with who we really are. When I first started working at Beacon 13 years ago or so, I had just come from New Jersey, had just left a congregation out there, took a huge leap, had no work out here for the first 6 months. And that year was 2009. And some of you may recognize that we had a house in New Jersey that we weren't able to sell. So we were hitting foreclosure, and the stresses of that were immense. And as I was trying to find work locally, I was spending a lot of time in a book that was about Jesus, but in particular was just looking very closely at just the words that he said, and the words we most likely think only he said, that they weren't attributable to anybody else or weren't written in some other context. And so it was these words coming up for me were like, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. That was probably the one that stuck with me the most through that time, thinking about that. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. And things like, God sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. And whatsoever you do for the least of these, you do for me. And he who has not sinned, cast the first stone, which many people think Jesus didn't say, but still it's a powerful line and powerful story. And somehow, through some miracle of life, I ended up getting the job at Beacon, despite very little experience with people who were homeless at that time. And that energy just kind of entered into the work from the very beginning. It was this sense of, here's me confronting with this huge failure of leaving a profession that had been incredibly powerful for me, all because of trying to honestly save my marriage, which didn't end up getting saved, and was very much sitting in all of that. And right next to so many people struggling with homelessness and with despair and with challenge and struggle and addiction and mental illness and poverty and all of it. And finding in all of that this space for communion, knowing very clearly that I had a different level of privilege, a different level of background, a different level of resources, yet at the same time, finding a place where we were, not just I, but we. The Buddhists teach us that integration comes with awareness of and compassion towards, but not ownership of these difficult issues. Awareness of and compassion towards, but not ownership of these difficult issues. We don't need to become angry in order to witness our feelings of anger. We don't need to act lustfully to witness our longings for sex. We don't need to act arrogantly to note our hunger for recognition. We only need to witness. Often when we've repressed something for years or even decades, to move to the other extreme, just letting those emotions explode into hurtful actions. Yet through simple presence, through simple open-hearted compassion to what lies within, we can move beyond those swings of expression and repression to a place of peace and equanimity. That's often why, if you will, religious conservatism seeks to suppress, or any of us seeks to suppress these emotions, is because when they explode forth, they often explode forth in very dangerous ways. But I think there's something different or deeper there, that if we can embrace them and accept them and acknowledge them, that we can heal them and find the wholeness that's longing there beneath them. And that leads to kind of a peace and inner integration. It leads to our own ability to not just love ourselves, but to love others. That when we accept things within ourselves completely, it allows us to accept others too. And the greater capacity we have to be present and compassionate to the shadows within ourselves, the greater the capacity we have to widen our circles to include the human family, and ultimately perhaps all of life. You know, and it's, I mentioned this earlier, but it's one of the reasons that I appreciate Jesus so much. You know, I think I would describe myself as a classic Unitarian, in the sense that I embrace Jesus as a person who taught us amazing, amazing things. And earlier in my life, you know, as a young Catholic boy, you know, I kind of had to do some rejection of Christianity and Catholicism and that background, as there were many things that I struggled with. But later, over time, I've come to just sit with and appreciate and more embrace how much Jesus has been a transformative figure in my own life. And I think that's because he was famous for his compassion for the marginalized. And he sat and he ate with beggars and prostitutes and lepers and cheats and traitors. And I believe Jesus was able to do this, was able to love the sick and the weak and the ugly, because he was able to love the sick and the weak and the ugly within himself. It was not Jesus's supposed purity that made him great, but his compassion for his impurity and the impurities of others. And to such, I believe we are called: wholeness within, oneness without. Is this challenging? Yes. Is it painful at times? Yes. Do our hearts sometimes break with the struggle of it? Yes. Yet Buddhist scholar Joanna Macy reminds us that the heart that breaks open can contain the whole world. The heart that breaks open can contain the whole world. And I, at last, richer by a hoard of years and tears, looked into their eyes and found the heavy word that bent my neck and bowed my head like a shamed child. Then I mumbled low, "We, God." Shalom, amen, and blessed be.